The courtroom smelled of expensive mahogany and cheap cruelty. "Look at yourself, Shyla," Bennett Montgomery sneered, tossing a worn $5 wallet onto the defense table. "That's your net worth. You're a waitress with a GED, and you think you're entitled to a dime of the Montgomery estate? You're a parasite I'm finally scraping off my shoe." He laughed, a sound as cold as the diamond watch on his wrist, while his legal team chuckled in sync. Shyla Cooper sat in silence, her fingers trembling over a burner phone. He didn't know that the woman he called a poverty-stricken mistake was actually the only heir to the Vanderbilt Rothschild global conglomerate, and the man currently walking through the courthouse doors with a fleet of federal agents wasn't a process server. He was her father, coming to collect a debt that money couldn't pay. The marriage of Shyla Cooper and Bennett Montgomery had been the talk of the Chicago social circuit for all the wrong reasons. Bennett was the scion of Montgomery Logistics, a man whose blood ran with old money and new arrogance. Shyla, on the other hand, was the charity case, or so everyone believed. They had met 3 years prior in a rain-drenched library. Shyla had been dressed in a faded thrift store coat, researching historical archives, while Bennett was hiding from a PR scandal. He was struck by her quiet beauty and what he perceived as her simplicity. To Bennett, Shyla was a blank slate, someone he could mold, someone who would be so grateful for his wealth that she would never question his infidelities or his ego. "I'm choosing you over a dozen debutantes," Bennett had told her on their wedding night, pouring a glass of $2,000 scotch. "Don't ever forget where you came from, Shyla. You were a girl with nothing. I gave you a name." Shyla had smiled softly, hiding the secret that burned in her chest. She hadn't married him for the Montgomery millions. She had married him because she truly thought she had found a man who loved her for her mind, not her pedigree. She had spent her entire life running away from the suffocating weight of her father's shadow. Thomas Vanderbilt, a man whose wealth was so vast it influenced national GDPs. To prove she could survive on her own, she had lived in a studio apartment, worked 2 jobs, and never used her real last name. But the simplicity Bennett loved soon became the target of his resentment. By the 2nd year of marriage, the mask slipped. Bennett's business was struggling due to his own reckless gambling on the stock market, and he took his frustrations out on Shyla. He cut off her credit cards, forcing her to ask for an allowance like a child. He mocked her peasant tastes when she preferred a home-cooked meal over a $500 a plate gala. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon at the Montgomery Manor in Lake Forest. Shyla had found a set of emerald earrings in Bennett's coat pocket. Earrings that weren't for her. When she confronted him, he didn't even bother to lie. "They're for someone who actually knows how to wear them, Shyla," Bennett said, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. "A woman with class, not someone who still shops the clearance rack at the grocery store. Look at your shoes, they're scuffed. You're an embarrassment to the Montgomery legacy." "I want a divorce, Bennett," Shyla said, her voice steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. Bennett froze, then let out a sharp, barking laugh. "A divorce? With what lawyer? You don't have a cent to your name. My father's prenup is ironclad. If you leave with exactly what you brought in. A suitcase of rags and a library card. You'll be back on the streets within a week, begging for a shift at the diner." "I'd rather be a waitress than a Montgomery," she countered. Bennett stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Fine. Let's do it. I'll make sure the settlement reflects your true value. 0. I'm going to humiliate you so badly in court that no man in this city will ever look at you again. You want to be poor? I'll make sure you're famous for it." Shyla left that night with 1 suitcase. She didn't go to a hotel. She went to a small, dusty apartment in the South Side, the kind of place Bennett wouldn't step foot in without a bodyguard. She took a job at Lakeside Grill, scrubbing tables and taking orders from truckers. For 6 months, she lived on tips and tap water, ignoring the process servers who hounded her with increasingly aggressive legal threats. Bennett's lawyer, a shark named Dominic Vance, sent her letters detailing how they were going to sue her for emotional distress and reputational damage. They wanted her to sign a gag order that would prevent her from ever speaking about their marriage in exchange for a paltry $5,000. Shyla ignored them all. She was waiting. She was waiting for the one date she knew Bennett couldn't avoid, the annual Founders' Day auction, where the wealthiest families in the Midwest gathered to flaunt their power. Bennett needed her there to sign the final dissolution papers in front of a private notary to avoid a public trial that might spook his investors. He wanted one last chance to mock her in front of his peers. But Shyla had made a phone call the night before, a call she hadn't made in 5 years. "Father," she had whispered into the burner phone. The voice on the other end was like gravel and silk. "Shyla, I've been watching. I told you he was a small man. Are you ready to come home?" "No," Shyla said, watching the neon sign of the diner flicker outside her window. "I'm ready to end him." "Then I shall bring the fleet," Thomas Vanderbilt replied. As part 1 closes, Shyla stands in the locker room of the diner, peeling off her grease-stained apron. Tomorrow she wouldn't be the poverty-stricken ex. Tomorrow she would be the daughter of the man who owned the bank that held Bennett's mortgage. The gold room at the Drake Hotel was a sea of black ties and silk gowns. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the low hum of deals being brokered and reputations being shredded. Bennett Montgomery stood at the center of a semicircle of investors, holding a flute of vintage Krug. He looked every bit the victor. His suit was a bespoke $8,000 navy wool, and his smile was as sharp as a razor. "To the future," Bennett toasted, clinking glasses with Arthur Sterling, a high-stakes developer he was desperate to impress. "Once I clear the dead weight from my personal life tonight, Montgomery Logistics is going global." "I heard she's working at a diner, Bennett," one of the men chuckled. "The waitress princess. You really picked a winner there." Bennett's lip curled. She was a charity project that failed. Tonight, I'm putting her back where I found her. The gutter. She's coming here to sign the final papers in front of a private notary. I wanted her to see what she's losing one last time. It's a lesson in humility. At that moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom creaked open. The room didn't go silent. Not yet, but the temperature seemed to drop. Shyla Cooper walked in. She wasn't wearing a gown. She was wearing her Lakeside Grill uniform, a faded blue polyester polo with Shyla embroidered in yellow thread, dark jeans, and scuffed non-slip sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a battered plastic folder. The whispers started like a forest fire. "Is that her? Good God, she actually showed up looking like a janitor." The audacity. Bennett's face turned a mottled shade of purple. He marched toward her, his polished shoes clicking aggressively on the marble. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, grabbing her elbow and steering her toward a shadowed alcove near the stage. "I told you to dress appropriately for a legal signing. You look like you're here to mop the floors." Shyla pulled her arm away, her expression unreadable. "I am dressed appropriately, Bennett. I'm dressed as the woman you told the court has zero market value. This is the woman you're divorcing, remember? The one who isn't worth a dime of your estate." "You're a disgrace," Bennett spat. He signaled to his lawyer, Dominic Vance, who was waiting with a stack of documents. "Let's get this over with. Sign the papers, take your $5,000 pity check, and disappear. I have a business to run and a life to lead." They sat at a small table just off stage. The auctioneer was already warming up the crowd, the rhythmic chant of numbers filling the air. "Clause 4, Dominic Vance drawled, tapping a gold fountain pen on the paper. "You waive all rights to any Montgomery holdings, real estate, or future earnings. In exchange, Mr. Montgomery will provide a one-time relocation fee. Sign here, Shyla." Shyla didn't pick up the pen. Instead, she looked out at the crowd. She saw the wealthy elite of Chicago, The same people who had snubbed her for years, laughing and pointing at her uniform. "Before I sign," Shyla said, her voice carrying further than Bennett liked, "I want to confirm one thing. Bennett, you stated in your filing that my presence in your life caused irreparable financial harm and that you are currently the sole provider of all marital assets, correct?" "Correct," Bennett smirked. "I paid for the roof over your head, the food in your mouth, and the very air you breathed for 3 years. You brought nothing but your poverty into this house." "And you're absolutely sure," she continued, "that Montgomery Logistics is on stable ground? No hidden debts? No desperate need for a bailout?" Bennett's eyes flickered with a brief, cold flash of panic. "My business is none of your concern. Just sign the damn paper." Suddenly the auctioneer's gavel banged loudly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer shouted, "we have an unexpected addition to tonight's catalogue. Item number 402, the majority debt holdings and prime mortgages of Montgomery Logistics and the Montgomery Manor." The room went deathly silent. Bennett stood up so fast his chair toppled over. "What? That's impossible. Those aren't for sale." "Actually, they are," a voice boomed from the back of the hall. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, silver-haired, and wore a suit that made Bennett's look like a discount rack find. He was flanked by 4 men in dark suits who moved with the precision of Secret Service agents. The room gasped. It was William Hawthorne, the chief CEO of Vanderbilt Global. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly at Shyla. "Who the hell are you?" Bennett demanded, his voice cracking. "I'm the man who just bought your life, Mr. Montgomery," Hawthorne said calmly, "and I didn't buy it for myself. I bought it for my employer." He walked to the table where Shyla sat. He didn't hand her a check. He handed her a black titanium card and bowed deeply. "The transfer is complete, Miss Vanderbilt," Hawthorne said. "You now own 80% of Montgomery Logistics, and as of 5 minutes ago, you are your ex-husband's landlord." Shyla stood up. She looked at the papers Dominic Vance had placed before her. Slowly, deliberately, she picked up the gold fountain pen and ripped the divorce settlement in half. "You were right about one thing, Bennett," Shyla said, her voice echoing in the stunned silence. "I don't need a dime of the Montgomery estate, because as of tonight, I own it." Bennett's face went white. He looked at Shyla, then at the billionaire standing beside her, and then at his own lawyer, who was suddenly looking very, very afraid. "Vanderbilt?" Bennett whispered. You're a Vanderbilt?" "The only one," Shyla replied. "And you just mocked the woman who holds your entire future in her hands." The silence in the Drake Hotel's gold room was so heavy, it felt physical. Bennett Montgomery stood frozen, his hand still reaching for a drink that no longer seemed to offer any comfort. The investors who had been clinking glasses with him moments ago began to retreat like a receding tide, leaving him isolated in the center of the floor. "This is a joke," Bennett stammered, his eyes darting from Shyla to William Hawthorne. "A publicity stunt. Shyla, I know you're desperate, but hiring actors to play the Vanderbilt legal team, that's a new low, even for a waitress." William Hawthorne didn't flinch. He signaled to one of his associates, who opened a leather briefcase and produced a tablet. With a swift swipe, a series of documents were projected onto the large screens typically used for auction lot descriptions. "As of 6 p.m. tonight," Hawthorne announced, "Vanderbilt Global acquired the delinquent debt of Montgomery Logistics from First National Bank. We also purchased the mezzanine financing held by Blackstone and Company, which Mr. Montgomery used as collateral for his recent failed venture in the South China Sea." A collective gasp went up as the screens displayed the staggering numbers. Bennett wasn't just struggling, he was underwater by nearly $200 million. "You see, Bennett," Shyla said, stepping around the table. She looked at her scuffed sneakers, then back up at him with a piercing clarity he had never seen before. "When you cut off my credit cards, you thought you were teaching me a lesson in dependency. But all you did was give me time to look into the books. I might have been a simple girl to you, but I've been a Vanderbilt since the day I was born. We don't just spend money. We understand how it moves. You spied on me? Bennett hissed, his arrogance flickering back into a desperate flame. I protected my interests, Schuyler corrected. Interests you tried to dissolve tonight for $5,000. Dominic Vance, Bennett's lawyer, tried to intervene. Now hold on. This acquisition is highly irregular. There are waiting periods, disclosures. Mr. Vance, Hawthorne interrupted, his voice like a guillotine. I suggest you check your own firm's bank account. Vanderbilt Global purchased your law firm, Vance & Associates, 45 minutes ago. You no longer represent Mr. Montgomery. In fact, you are currently unemployed, pending an internal audit into your creative billing practices. Dominic's jaw dropped. He looked at his phone, which was suddenly blowing up with notifications. He turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving Bennett completely alone. Bennett looked around the room, searching for an ally. He spotted Arthur Sterling, the developer he'd been courting all night. Arthur, you know my business is solid. This is just a hostile takeover. Tell them. Arthur Sterling took a long sip of his drink and looked at the ceiling. Sorry, Bennett. I don't do business with people who are being sued by the Vanderbilts. It's bad for the brand. Schuyler walked closer to Bennett until she was standing just inches away. The contrast was jarring. The man in the $8,000 suit trembling, and the woman in the grease-stained diner uniform standing tall. You told me I had zero market value, Schuyler whispered, loud enough for the front row of socialites to hear. But it turns out the only thing in this room with zero value is your word. Tomorrow morning, my father's bailiffs will arrive at the manor. You have until noon to vacate the premises. Take your suits, take your scotch, and take those emerald earrings you bought for Clarissa Montague. Bennett's face went from white to a sickly grey. How did you— I know everything, Bennett. I knew about Clarissa. I knew about the offshore accounts in the Caymans, which, by the way, have been frozen by the SEC thanks to a tip from our compliance department. You thought you were playing a game with a pawn. You didn't realize you were sitting across from the Queen. Schuyler turned to the auctioneer, who was staring at her with wide eyes. I believe item 402 is mine, she asked. Yes, Miss Vanderbilt, the man stuttered. Good, cancel the auction. I'm not selling the debt. I'm calling it in. Every cent, immediately. She turned back to Bennett, who looked like he was about to collapse. You wanted me to go back to the gutter, Bennett? Well, I'm going back to my diner. I have a shift to finish. But you're going to find out what it's really like to have nothing. No name, no money, and no one to catch you when you fall. Schuyler walked out of the gold room, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back. Oh, and Bennett? The shoes aren't scuffed. They're just broken in. Something you're about to learn a lot about. She stepped out into the crisp Chicago night, where a fleet of black SUVs was waiting, but she didn't get in. She walked across the street to the bus stop, sitting on the bench in her blue polo, waiting for the #22 to take her back to the South Side. She had one more night as Schuyler Cooper before she became Schuyler Vanderbilt again, and she wanted to savor every second of his ruin. The bus ride to the South Side was the quietest 30 minutes of Schuyler's life, while the world of the Chicago elite was currently exploding with the news of the Vanderbilt revelation. Schuyler sat on the cracked vinyl seat, watching the city lights blur. Her phone was buzzing incessantly. Notifications from news outlets, frantic texts from Bennett, and groveling apologies from people who had ignored her for 3 years. She turned it off. When she arrived at Lakeside Grill, the closed sign was already flipped. Standing by the door was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. Thomas Vanderbilt did not belong in front of a greasy spoon diner. His presence turned the sidewalk into a sovereign territory. He was wearing a charcoal overcoat that cost more than the diner's annual lease, and his eyes, sharp and blue like Shyla's, softened only when they landed on her. "You're late for your shift, Shyla," Thomas said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I had some papers to shred, Father," she replied, walking into his arms for a brief, firm hug. They walked inside. The owner of the diner, Hank Cooper, the man who had given Shyla a job and a fake last name to protect her, was busy brewing a fresh pot of coffee. He looked at Thomas with a mixture of respect and wariness. "You really did it, kid," Hank said, sliding a mug across the counter to Shyla. "The news is already calling it the billion-dollar divorce massacre." "It's not about the money, Hank," Shyla said, taking a sip. "It was about the truth." "The truth is expensive," Thomas interjected, sitting on a swivel stool that looked far too small for him. "Bennett Montgomery is a cornered rat. My sources tell me he spent the last 2 hours at the Union League Club, trying to convince Robert Thorne and Silas Blackwood to give him an emergency loan. He's trying to move his personal assets into a trust before the freeze hits." "Let him try," Shyla said coolly. "Thorne and Blackwood won't touch him. I already sent Hawthorne to speak with them. If they help Bennett, they lose the Vanderbilt shipping contracts." Thomas nodded, a glint of pride in his eyes. "You've learned. But don't underestimate the desperation of a man who has never known the word no. Bennett has filed an emergency injunction. He's claiming you committed marriage fraud, that you entered the union under a false identity to dismantle his company from the inside. He's calling it corporate espionage by matrimony." Shyla laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "He's the one who insisted on the prenup. He's the one who insisted I was a nobody in his legal filings. He ground that identity into the court records himself." "Regardless," Thomas said, his tone turning serious, "there is a hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. Judge Clarence Vance, no relation to his lawyer, though they share a country club, is presiding. He's old school, Shyla. He might find your deception distasteful. You need to stop being a waitress tomorrow. You need to be my daughter. Underscore, 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 underscore." While Shyla and Thomas talked in the diner, the scene at the Montgomery Manor was one of pure chaos. Bennett was throwing clothes into suitcases while a crew of movers, hired by Shyla's legal team, began tagging furniture with "Property of Vanderbilt Global" stickers. "You can't do this," Bennett screamed at a young man holding a clipboard. "That's a Rembrandt. It's been in my family for 3 generations. "Actually, sir," the man said without looking up, "it was used as collateral for a loan from Sotheby's Financial in 2024. The loan is into default. The Vanderbilt estate purchased the note. This belongs to Miss Cooper now." Bennett kicked a mahogany side table, his face twisted in a mask of rage. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he had sworn never to use. "It's Bennett," he said when the call connected. "I need the cleaner. No, I don't care about the cost. Shyla Cooper, or Vanderbilt, whatever she calls herself. I need something on her. Not just financial. I need something that will make the judge look at her like she's a criminal. She lived in the South Side for 6 months. No one stays clean in that neighborhood. Find the dirt, or I'm going to prison, and I'm taking you down with me for those offshore transfers." He hung up, breathing heavily. He looked at the empty spot on the wall where his portrait used to hang. "You think you won, Shyla?" he whispered to the empty room. "You're a Vanderbilt. That means you have more skeletons in your closet than I have debts in my ledger, and I'm going to find every single one." As the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, the stage was set for the final showdown. The waitress was gone. The Trillionaire's daughter was ready. But the man she had married was about to play a card so dirty it would threaten to destroy the very name she had just reclaimed. The Cook County Courthouse was besieged by news vans and paparazzi. The story of the waitress heiress had gone viral overnight. turning a private divorce into a global spectacle. Shyla arrived in a convoy of armored SUVs, but she didn't wear the designer power suit her father's stylists had prepared. Instead, she wore a simple, charcoal-grey wool dress and the same small silver locket she had worn every day at the diner. Inside courtroom 402, the air was thick with tension. Judge Clarence Vance sat on his bench like a gargoyle carved from ice. He was known for his moral rectitude, a man who valued tradition over technicalities. Bennett Montgomery sat at the petitioner's table looking surprisingly composed. Beside him sat a new face, Gregory Drake, a legal mercenary known for disappearing the problems of the ultra-wealthy. "Your Honor," Drake began, standing before the bench with a chilling smile. "While the media is enamored with this Cinderella story, we are here to discuss a grave injustice. Shyla Cooper, or Shyla Vanderbilt, entered this marriage with a premeditated plan to deceive. She withheld her identity to bypass the Montgomery family's security protocols and gain access to their proprietary logistics algorithms," the gallery murmured. This wasn't about money anymore. It was an accusation of corporate espionage. "Furthermore," Drake continued, dropping a thick folder onto the judge's desk, "we have evidence that during her undercover stint on the South Side, Miss Vanderbilt was engaged in activities that would make this court question her fitness for any settlement. We have photos of her meeting with known associates of the Vance crime syndicate at the Lakeside Grill." Shyla's heart skipped a beat. She knew who he was talking about. Hank Cooper, the diner owner, had a past he had left behind 20 years ago. Bennett was trying to use her protector's history to bury her. She wasn't just a waitress, Drake sneered. She was a conduit for money laundering, using her poverty as a front to move Vanderbilt capital through a grease trap diner. Judge Vance looked at Shyla, his eyes narrowed. "Miss Vanderbilt, do you have a response to these allegations of criminal association?" Thomas Vanderbilt started to rise, his face darkening with rage, but Shyla placed a firm hand on his arm. She stood up, walking slowly toward the center of the room. "Your Honor," Shyla said, her voice resonant and calm, "Mr. Montgomery is correct about one thing. I did choose the South Side. I chose it because it was the only place I could find people who had more integrity in their fingernails than Bennett Montgomery has in his entire lineage." "Integrity?" Bennett scoffed from his seat. "You were hanging out with a convicted felon, Shyla. Hank Cooper served 10 years for protecting his younger sister from a predatory landlord," Shyla interrupted, her eyes flashing. "The same kind of predator you are, Bennett. And as for money laundering?" She turned to her father's assistant, William Hawthorne, who handed her a single, notarized document. "This is the tax audit for Lakeside Grill for the last 6 months, Shyla said, placing it before the judge. "It shows that every cent of my wages was accounted for. But more importantly, Your Honor, I'd like you to look at the second document. It's a series of wire transfers from a shell company called Mont Logistics Caymans." Bennett's smirk vanished. "While Mr. Montgomery was accusing me of laundering money," Shyla continued, "he was actually funneling his remaining company assets into an offshore account held in the name of his mistress, Clarissa Montague. He wasn't worried about my criminal associations. He was worried I'd find out he was bankrupting his employees' pension funds to pay for his divorce." The courtroom erupted. Judge Vance slammed his gavel, his face turning a deep shade of red. "Is this true, Mr. Drake?" the judge barked. Drake looked at the documents, then at Bennett. He saw the sweat beading on his client's forehead. The cleaner realized the room was suddenly very, very dirty. I would need to review these, Your Honor," Drake stammered. "No need," a new voice boomed. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 men in dark windbreakers with SEC printed in bold yellow letters walked in. "Judge Vance," the lead agent said, "we have a warrant for the arrest of Bennett Montgomery for securities fraud, embezzlement, and the illegal transfer of pension funds. We'll take it from here." Bennett tried to bolt for the side exit, but he was blocked by Thomas Vanderbilt's security team. He turned back to the room, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You did this!" he screamed at Shyla. "You planned this from the start! You let me marry you just to destroy me!" Shyla walked up to him as the federal agents moved in with handcuffs. She leaned in close, so only he could hear. "I didn't marry you to destroy you, Bennett," she whispered. "I married you because I loved the man I thought you were. You destroyed yourself. I just gave you the bill." As the cuffs clicked shut around Bennett's wrists, he looked down at his shoes, the $8,000 bespoke leather. They were covered in a fine layer of dust from the courtroom floor. For the first time in his life, Bennett Montgomery realized that no amount of money could buy back the soul he had sold for a seat at the top. The news of Bennett Montgomery's arrest in his own divorce court spread through the Chicago skyline faster than a winter gale. By the time Shyla and her father reached the sidewalk, the story was already a trending headline. "The Trillionaire's Trap: How Shyla Vanderbilt Toppled an Empire." But Shyla didn't want the cameras or the champagne. She looked at the silver locket around her neck, the one she'd bought with her first week tips at Lakeside Grill, and then at the man beside her. "I need to go back, Father," Shyla said, as a valet held open the door to the armored Maybach. "To the manor?" Thomas Vanderbilt asked, his eyes already scanning his phone for the next acquisition. "The cleaning crews have already finished. It's yours now." "No," Shyla replied, her voice firm. "To the diner. I have a debt to pay that isn't on a ledger." Thomas paused, his gaze sharpening. He saw the resolve in her eyes, a resolve he had spent 20 years trying to instill in her through boardrooms, only for her to find it in a grease-trap kitchen. "I'll have Hawthorne follow with the security detail." "No security," Shyla said. "Just me." When Shyla arrived at Lakeside Grill, the neon sign was humming with a low, comforting buzz. Inside, Hank Cooper was mopping the floors, the rhythmic swish-slap of the mop, the only sound in the empty restaurant. He didn't look up when the bell chimed. "We're closed, Shyla. Or should I call you Miss Vanderbilt now?" Hank asked, his voice gravelly and tired. Shyla walked to the counter and sat on the same wobbly stool she had occupied for 6 months. "You should call me Shyla, Hank. Always." Hank stopped mopping and looked at her. His face, weathered by years of hard labor and a past he'd tried to bury, was unreadable. "I saw the news. They mentioned my name. They mentioned the Vance Syndicate. You shouldn't have brought that up in court, kid. You've got a bright future now. You don't need a guy like me staining your reputation." "You didn't stain it, Hank. You saved it," Shyla said. She reached into a small bag and pulled out a heavy, manila envelope. Bennett was right about one thing. I was meeting with people associated with the syndicate. But he didn't realize I wasn't laundering money. I was buying up the predatory loans they held over this neighborhood, starting with this one. She slid the envelope across the grease-stained counter. Hank opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was the original deed to the Lakeside Grill, along with the deeds to the entire city block. "I bought the block, Hank," Shyla whispered, "and I've transferred the titles to a community trust. You're the chairman. No more protection money. No more landlords trying to squeeze you out. This place belongs to the people who actually live here now." Hank stared at the papers, a single tear carving a path through the dust on his cheek. "Why, I'm just a guy who gave you a job when you were hiding from a rich jerk." "Because when I had nothing, you gave me a name," Shyla said, placing her hand over his. "You gave me the Cooper name to hide behind, and in doing so, you gave me the strength to remember who I was. My father taught me how to win, Hank, but you taught me how to survive." As she walked out of the diner, she saw her father's car parked at the end of the block. Thomas Vanderbilt was standing by the trunk, looking at the dilapidated buildings of the South Side with a strange, nostalgic expression. "You gave it all away," Thomas said as she approached. "That block is worth $30 million in development potential." It's worth more than that to them, Schuyler countered. Thomas nodded slowly. I suppose it is. But there's one more thing you need to know, Schuyler, about why I let you stay here for 6 months without dragging you home. Schuyler froze. What do you mean, let me? You think I didn't know where you were the night you left, Bennett? Thomas asked, a cold light entering his eyes. I've had a team on you since you were 5. I watched you take that job. I watched you live in that cold apartment. You watched me struggle? Schuyler's voice rose in disbelief. I was eating canned soup and freezing while you were in a penthouse. I needed you to see the bottom, Schuyler, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Because I'm not just a businessman. I'm a king, and a king's heir cannot rule if they think the world is made of silk. I wanted you to hate the poverty so much that you would do anything to protect the empire. But more importantly, he stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. I needed a reason to destroy the Montgomerys once and for all. Their logistics network was the only thing standing in the way of our global monopoly. If you hadn't married him, I would have had to find another way to ruin them. You were the perfect Trojan horse, Schuyler, and you played your part beautifully. Schuyler felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago wind. She looked at the man she called father, the man who had just saved her, and realized he was the same animal as Bennett, just bigger, smarter, and far more patient. Was any of it real? Schuyler asked, her voice trembling. Did you even care that he was hurting me? I cared that he was wasting my investment, Thomas replied coldly. Now get in the car. We have a board meeting at 8 a.m. You're the new CEO of Montgomery Vanderbilt. It's time to show the world what happens when a waitress takes the throne. Schuyler looked back at the diner, at the small light in the window where Hank was still standing. She realized that the war wasn't over. She had defeated the man who mocked her poverty, but now she had to face the man who had manufactured her struggle. The boardroom of Vanderbilt Global sat on the 102nd floor, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that made the rest of Chicago look like a child's Lego set. At this altitude, the clouds drifted past the windows like ghosts of the people living below, distant and insignificant. Inside, the air was pressurized, filtered, and smelled of cold ozone and expensive upholstery. At the head of the table sat Thomas Vanderbilt, his fingers steepled, his presence radiating an almost gravitational pull. Surrounding him were the board members, men like Robert Thorne and Arthur Sterling, who had pivoted their loyalty to the winning side with sickening speed. Just days ago, they had been laughing at Bennett's jokes at the Drake Hotel. Now they sat in somber silence, waiting to see how the spoils of the Montgomery Empire would be divided. The heavy double doors swung open with a synchronized click of magnetic locks. Schuyler walked in, but she didn't look like the woman from the courtroom or the girl from the diner. She wore a sharp, tailored suit in Vanderbilt blue, a shade so deep it was almost black, her hair sleek and pulled back into a high, disciplined ponytail. Her expression was a mask of unreadable marble. Behind her walked William Hawthorne, carrying a single, thin leather portfolio like a holy relic. "Gentlemen," Thomas announced, standing up with a practiced, paternal smile, "I'd like to introduce the new CEO of our newest subsidiary, Montgomery Vanderbilt Logistics. Schuyler, the floor is yours to outline the integration strategy." The board members began to clap, a polite, hollow sound that echoed against the glass. Schuyler didn't go to the seat at the side of the table. She didn't acknowledge their applause. She walked directly to the head of the table, standing right next to her father. She didn't sit. She remained standing, her height nearly matching his, her eyes fixed on the horizon, before she slowly turned them towards the men in the room. "Thank you, Father," Schuyler said, her voice echoing with a new metallic edge that made Robert Thorne shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I've spent the last 12 hours reviewing the integration strategy you drafted. It's a masterpiece of corporate efficiency. It effectively liquidates the Montgomery assets, fires 4,000 redundant warehouse workers, most of whom have given 20 years to that company, and creates a shipping monopoly that will raise consumer prices by 20% across the Midwest. Thomas's smile didn't waver, though his eyes sharpened. Efficiency is the language of power, Schuyler. We are in the business of growth, not charity. Those 4,000 workers are yesterday's overhead. Today we focus on the margin. I agree that the language of power is important, Schuyler said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming a calm, terrifying silk. But I've made a few changes to the syntax. Hawthorne? Hawthorne stepped forward, his face as impassive as Schuyler's, and began distributing documents to the board members. The sound of rustling paper was the only noise in the room for several long minutes. As they read, the color drained from their faces. Arthur Sterling's hand began to shake, causing the paper to rattle. "What is this?" Sterling stammered, looking up at Thomas and then at Schuyler. "A spin-off. This document suggests you're turning Montgomery Logistics into a worker-owned cooperative. You're granting equity to the warehouse staff. That's socialist suicide." "I've used my controlling interest," Schuyler said, looking directly into her father's eyes, ignoring the sputtering men around her, "to decouple the Montgomery assets from Vanderbilt Global. I am the sole owner of that debt, remember? You bought it for me, Father. You gave me the weapon, the legal standing, and the financial leverage. You just didn't expect me to point it at the Empire." Thomas's smile finally vanished. The mask of the proud father dropped, revealing the cold, calculating titan underneath. "Schuyler, don't be a fool. You're throwing away billions. You're destroying the very monopoly I spent 30 years preparing for you. Do you have any idea how much political capital was spent to clear the path for this merger?" "I'm not destroying it, Father. I'm evolving it," Schuyler countered. She walked to the window, looking down at the tiny, crawling lights of the city. "I'm keeping the logistics network, the trucks, the warehouses, the software. But I'm restructuring the board. I'm replacing Thorne, Sterling, and the rest of your cronies with people who actually know how the world works. People who have felt the weight of a box and the sting of a late paycheck. People like Hank Cooper." The boardroom erupted. "A felon?" Thorne shouted, standing up. "You're putting a South Side grease monkey on a billion-dollar board. This is an insult to every man in this room." "Sit down, Robert," Schuyler said, not even turning around. The sheer authority in her voice caused him to drop back into his chair as if he'd been struck. "Hank Cooper understands logistics better than any of you. He knows how to move goods through a neighborhood when the roads are blocked. He knows how to keep a crew loyal when the heat is off. He has more integrity in his calloused thumbs than you have in your entire lineage." "You can't do this," Thomas hissed, stepping closer to her, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that would have terrified Schuyler 6 months ago. "I made you. I allowed that divorce to happen, to forge you into a weapon. I watched you suffer, so you would come back to me with the hunger required to rule this company." Schuyler turned from the window, her face illuminated by the cold morning sun. "You made a mistake, Father. You thought that by showing me the bottom, I would fear it. You thought I would see the South Side as a dark place to be escaped. But all you did was show me that the people at the bottom are stronger, kinder, and more resilient than you will ever be. You used me as a Trojan horse to enter Bennett's house? Well, I'm the Trojan horse in yours now." She reached into the portfolio Hawthorne held and slid a final paper across the table toward Thomas. It was a resignation letter, pre-drafted, needing only his signature. "The board of Vanderbilt Global is currently being investigated by the SEC," Schuyler informed the room, her gaze sweeping over the board members, who suddenly looked very small in their expensive chairs. "The same agents who took Bennett into custody are currently looking into the predatory acquisition tactics you used to tank Montgomery's stock before the merger. They're looking at the insider trading, the manufactured labor strikes, and the offshore consulting fees." Thomas looked at the paper, then at Schuyler. "You wouldn't. You'd destroy the family name." "The name is already stained, Father," Shyla said. "I'm just the one doing the laundry. If you resign now and hand over the chairmanship to a neutral trust, one that I will oversee, I might be able to keep you out of a jumpsuit. I've already negotiated a settlement with the SEC. It involves a massive fine and your permanent removal from corporate governance." Thomas Vanderbilt looked at his daughter. For the first time in his life, he didn't see an investment, a tool, or an heir. He saw a peer. He saw a predator who had outhunted him in his own woods. He realized that the 6 months she spent as a waitress hadn't broken her. It had sharpened her into a blade that he had inadvertently placed against his own throat. Slowly, with a hand that finally showed the tremors of his age, Thomas picked up the gold pen. He signed the paper. "You really are a Vanderbilt, Shyla. God help us all." "No," Shyla said, taking the paper and handing it to Hawthorne. "I'm a Cooper Vanderbilt. I've learned how to sign the checks, but I'll never forget how to scrub the floors. This boardroom is closed. Hawthorne, escort these gentlemen to the elevator. Their personal effects will be couriered to them. Underscore, 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 underscore." 6 months later, Shyla stood on the balcony of her new office. It wasn't in the skyscraper. It was in a beautifully renovated industrial warehouse on the south side, overlooking the neighborhood that had saved her. The windows didn't look down on the people. They looked out at them. Bennett Montgomery was currently serving 10 years in a federal penitentiary. News reports said he had traded his $8,000 suits for orange polyester and was currently learning how to work in the prison laundry, a poetic irony that Shyla found deeply satisfying. Her father was in permanent retirement in a villa in the south of France, stripped of his voting rights and his relevance, a king without a country. A knock came at the door. Hank Cooper walked in. He was wearing a suit that looked slightly uncomfortable on his broad shoulders, but he carried it with a new sense of quiet dignity. "The first shipment of the cooperative's medical supplies just cleared the port, Shyla," Hank said, checking a tablet. "No delays, no bribes. Just honest work by people who actually care about the cargo. The workers are calling it the Vanderbilt miracle." "It's not a miracle, Hank," Shyla said, turning to him with a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It's just what happens when you treat people like humans instead of line items." "Whatever it is, it's working," Hank chuckled. He leaned against the doorframe, looking back towards the street, though the customers at the grill keep asking when the Trillionaire waitress is coming back for a shift. "We've got a new girl, but she can't handle the Sunday rush like you could." Shyla looked out at the city, at the lights of the south side twinkling like diamonds in the dark, and felt a peace she hadn't known in years. "Tell them I'll be there for the breakfast rush on Monday," she said. "I still have my own apron. And tell them the first round of coffee is on the CEO." She had started as a girl with a secret, became a wife with a nightmare, and emerged as a woman with a mission. The divorce hadn't just ended a marriage, it had started a revolution. And as the sun set over the skyline, Shyla knew that the greatest wealth wasn't what you kept in the bank. It was the power to decide who you were when the world told you that you were nothing. They say money talks, but in Shyla's world, it screamed. This wasn't just a story about a divorce. It was a masterclass in why you should never mistake someone's silence for weakness or their poverty for a lack of power. Bennett Montgomery thought he was discarding a worthless waitress, only to realize he was handing his entire empire to the woman who would eventually dismantle it. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that the person serving his coffee was the same person who held the deed to his life. Life has a funny way of balancing the books, and as we saw tonight, the waitress always gets the last word and the biggest tip. If you enjoyed this roller coaster of drama, justice, and the ultimate karmic payback, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to see that underdogs always have a bite. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of betrayal and triumph. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if you found out your poor partner was actually a trillionaire? Until next time, stay sharp, and remember, character is the only currency that never devalues. See you in the next story.